Well, hello, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Dr. Edi Bilimoria. And it's true to say he is a modern day polymath, someone who has worked on huge engineering projects, a concert pianist, a glider pilot, a choral singer, and a trained concert pianist. But his most important contribution, certainly in recent times, has been his monumental four-volume work, which is called Unfolding Consciousness. And this is an immense achievement. It runs to 750,000 words or more, and it comes in four very fat volumes. Now, I've been working with Eddie on this over the last couple of years to produce some shortened versions of this for the general reader. And we've managed to reduce this mighty tome to about 1/10 of its volume so that it fits into a 350-page paperback, which will be published in December, as far as I understand. So welcome, Eddie. Thank you very much for agreeing to do this interview. And obviously, it's going to focus on this very hot topic in the scientific and philosophical world at the moment, consciousness. Now, you embarked on this project 20 years ago. What actually put you onto this particular road?
It's a very fair question, Tim. But before that, may I express my heartfelt thanks to you for a sterling piece of redaction, if I can put it that way. And it's a real art, and you've really picked the nuggets out of it. So thank you very much for that. And thank you very much to the Theosophical Society in America for inviting me to talk with Tim. So what set me on this journey were really two things or two experiences. One was really a love of the subject. I've always loved researching, reading, writing about the ancient wisdom, the eternal precepts, the perennial philosophy. And this was really an expression of my love for the subject. But the second, more specific reason was I was getting rather fed up with, I can only use the word propagandist theosophists who kept pushing one particular corner of theosophy and saying, oh, you should read this book and not read that book. And HBB had the ultimate and don't read any Bessant, and Leadbeater got it all wrong. So it was my irritation with the sectarian attitudes in a society that really fundamentally has taught and believed in freedom of thought. So with that in mind, I was well aware with one of HBB's many great sayings, of course, but in the summing up of her volume 2, I think, The Secret Doctrine, she says that only by bringing all these various streams of science, religion, philosophy, have the educated classes realize that the commonality in all these various streams means that they must come from one central source. So it was an attempt to bring together these various streams and point to the central source of wisdom from which they all come, to show, therefore, that the science, religion, philosophy, occult science streams, however different colorings the water may be, they have come from one fountainhead of wisdom. And just on that note, great minds think alike. HBB said that Manly Hall in The Secret Teaching of All Ages, he says, science has given us 1,000,000 secrets. Of course, some of them are useful and wonderful, but they have caused also suffering and hardship and confusion. The ancients have given us one secret, and that one secret provides the answer to the conundrum of death and life eternal.
Now, one of the things that runs through your book is the common thread
Mm,
of this stuff, these ideas which are timeless, which vanish and reappear periodically through time. In fact, your book has actually inspired my latest film, The Eternal Thread, which looks at
oh,
the
it's
esoteric
wonderful.
history of the world,
Mm,
because
mm,
that was what I thought we need to show, that there is
mm,
this particularly common thread. Now, a lot of your book deals with, well, historical, but also contemporary attitudes of
yes. Mm,
science towards
mm,
consciousness.
mm,
And
mm,
herein lies a problem, doesn't it?
it
Because
does.
you're up against, or we are up against, scientism, that
Mm,
worldwide
mm,
religion
mm,
of science, which people follow unquestioningly.
mm,
Now, science basically can't understand the ageless wisdom idea that consciousness came first and that you don't
mm,
need a physical mechanism like a
mm,
brain in order
mm,
to have consciousness. How
mm.
easy is it to persuade scientists that there is this alternative view, or is the scientific mind so ossified and so doctrinaire that it can't absorb these ideas?
Well, you find, Tim, this very paradoxical situation that despite science, specifically quantum physics, demonstrating with such rigorous theory and impressive experiment evidence about the most fundamental unity of all life and the interconnection and entanglement of life at the deepest level, as indeed almost explicitly stated by the greatest of scientists like Henry Stapp and Schrodinger and many others. Yet the world has been united by a scientific theory, so to speak, and the world is also united digitally and electronically. But when we look around, there is tremendous disunity amongst not only the politicians, of course, but even the scientists, each in their own little pigeonholes, trying to find this or that theory. And the latest example, or one of many, is the Templeton Foundation awarding a prize of many, many millions on the latest experiment that can show how the brain produces consciousness. So, increasing number of scientists are moving over or crossing the Rubicon from materialism to a non-materialist worldview. And it can only be a matter of time before the last straw breaks the camel's back, so to speak. But from what I see, Tim, science is not so much, science is our best ally, even though it's the very thing that breaks our heads as said in my letters. But science is not so much corroborating specific details of the occult wisdom, so much as breaking down the basis of materialism and its presuppositions. So you've got to undermine the foundations first before you can deal with the substructure and the superstructure. So science is increasingly finding evidence of life in the universe, even though they like to look at it in terms of biological life, of course. But at least they are now admitting that there is not the possibility, but there is life outside the universe. The latest is the planet K2. They're also admitting in biology that there isn't that one single dimension from Neanderthal to man, but there was a crossbreeding that happened, during presumably the Precambrian age. And there are pockets of evidence that are increasingly breaking down the materialistic foundation,
Yes.
even consciousness. But though the mainstream will have nothing to do with it. So that's the problem we face.
Is one of the problems with science, Eddie? I mean, this is something that strikes me, that science has now fragmented into numerous disciplines, sub-disciplines, sub-sub-disciplines. So you wind up with all these separated silos of knowledge, all operating independently. And it seems to me that there are very few scientists who have an overview of biology, physics, and all the rest of it, and can somehow synthesize these ideas together. Is this over specialization? Is it standing in the way of science liberating itself?
It certainly is, Tim, and this was HBB's great foresight. Well, I mean, in the cover of Isis Unveiled, I believe she said that the just as a prism breaks the white light into the various colors, so the one universal wisdom has been broken by the intellectual mind into the various disciplines called the various sciences, physics and chemistry and biology and this and that. So it most certainly is standing in the way, but somehow we got to show that the prism does not create the colors. And if we may just remove the prism, we can see where the colors have come from. And that requires scientists really to have the courage to step outside the mainstream and not fear ridicule from their peers. But the Galileo Commission of the Scientific Medical Network, IONS, which you mentioned last time, are doing this. So it's a bit of a slow process, but inevitably it has to lead in one upward direction.
Yes, of course, this problem with people being cancelled or having their reputations
Mm,
ruined and
mm,
losing their posts and their livelihood is a very real one. And there
mm,
have been a brave coterie of scientists over the years,
mm,
like we always mention Rupert Sheldrake, because he's one
mm.
of the bravest people who has put his head on the block
Yeah.
and
Mm,
suggested that there are these connecting fields,
mm,
morphogenetic fields,
mm,
and
mm,
this is a huge contribution. Do you
mm.
think there are many more waiting in the wings, a younger cohort of scientists who are perhaps more ready to take up these ideas, or will they wind up being as closed-minded as the current generation?
Well, they might have to wait till they retire because then you can say what you like. But even when you think that even scientists, Nobel laureates like Brian Josephson, to name one, the way he is castigated is absolutely shameful. So the fortress of materialistic science is pretty impregnable. But I think in one way it is to show that we're not against materialism because the when you show an alternative viewpoint, it's regarded as a threat and an attack. And we applaud materialism, the fact that we're talking to each other thanks to materialism, alchemy and homeopathy won't do it. It's hard, wonderful science. So we applaud materialism. But all we're saying is for deeper questions, Mr. Scientist, please just look beyond. Don't throw it away, just look beyond. So we're talking of different dimensions of viewpoint, and not just regarding looking at things from a three-dimensional standpoint. You're looking deeper and seeing higher, invisible dimensions that are hidden in what you're seeing. So younger scientists, um, uh, from what I can see, there is in the scientific network, medical network, there is the new scientist paradigm, new paradigm movement, which is full of young scientists. Um, there are courses now put on by Les Lancaster of the Aleph Trust, which is attracting young scientists, and this is blossoming.
Now, we are at a very interesting point in human history for all sorts of reasons. We're moving from one cycle to another, one age to another, and there are various other important things that are happening. But also, this year sees the
Yes.
150th anniversary of the founding of the Theosophical Society by Madame Blavatsky, Colonel
Mm,
Olcott, William
mm,
Judge, and others.
mm,
And I was just thinking the other day about the three objects of the society, and we certainly agonized about brotherhood over the years, and people have argued intensively about what it actually involves. And then
mm,
the second object to study comparative religions
mm,
and science, etc., we've done. But the third object is the
mm.
one which I think, I might be wrong, but it strikes me this is the one that has been neglected to
Yes.
understand the hidden laws of nature and the powers latent in mankind. And it strikes me that this is a real opportunity for Theosophy to re-engage with science as it did in its early days. It had the great and the
Mm,
good from
mm,
the scientific community
mm,
knocking its doors down. But that
mm.
has not happened so much in recent decades. It strikes me this is an opportunity to re-engage with sympathetic scientists and to start to try and draw this bridge this gulf between science and spirituality.
Yes, Tim, the third object is vital, but you've got a two-edged sword here. It is absolutely one edge of the sword is absolutely vital, but it has to be done carefully. Otherwise, one can open a can of worms and invoke a whole host of psychic phenomena and confusion, which one can well do without in a world that is already confusing. Now, one way it seems to be happening now, in a big way, is using psychedelics to study different levels of consciousness. Now, I have grave reservations about that. We can or cannot talk about it, but this is really using science, if you like, in order to understand the different levels of consciousness that cannot be explained by conventional physical-based neuroscience. And this research is happening in Harvard, in Imperial College, in Oxford, in all of these very prestigious institutions. The other area I see where there is increasing interest and I think information is UAPs. I mean, they've gone away from identifying flying objects. It's identifying unidentifiable phenomena. But and Alex Gomez-Marin, who you interviewed, the wonderful director of the Pari Institute, has a whole series, as we speak, on individuals, top individuals in science, of course, talking about UAPs. So the fact that science is taking this seriously is yet another way of invoking the third object without getting involved in how do I raise my kundalini and how do I become clairvoyant, which is where the danger lies, in my opinion, because without complete management of one's own emotional nature and mental nature, any attempt, I need hardly say, to access these higher dimensions is absolutely fraught with danger. And I think that the fact that the third object has not had its due share is probably the veil that nature has put over it to protect us from its misuse.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about UFOs, and I'm going to carry on calling them that despite this
Yeah, yeah. Why not?
American rebranding exercise, which I
Why not?
think is perhaps a precursor to some greater degree of
Yes.
disclosure. We've certainly seen an amount of disclosure in recent times. But
Mm,
one of the really interesting things about this, Eddie, and when you watch some of the programs and some of the footage about this, these objects, these UAPs, UFOs,
mm,
appear and disappear very quickly. So people are talking about them as transdimensional craft.
mm, mm,
And this is very interesting because
mm,
it therefore introduces into the scientific community the idea that there are these other dimensions,
Yes,
which science
yes.
obviously is
Mm,
interested in exploring through string
mm.
theory and things of that nature as
Exactly.
well.
Yes, science has always been interested in higher dimensions, string theory and M theory, and Professor Bernard Carr is one of the main exponents of that wonderful research. And you rightly say transdimensional, yet um, they're looking at it still in terms of their own consciousness. So, for example, if they see something they can't explain, you hear, for example, God was an astronaut and he came in a spacesuit. Well, you don't need a spacesuit when you're living on different dimensions. So there is the danger to reduce everything to our perception, our vision, and our senses until we realize that there are senses and dimensions that transcend the physical.
And of course, science has been bold enough to admit that it can't see most of the universe, which is supposed to be there, and
Exactly.
ascribes the rest of
Exactly.
it to dark matter and dark
Yeah.
energy, which are very vague subjects. But I mean, what is it? 5% that we can see, or something like
Roughly
that?
5%. Baryonic matter, this sort of atoms and molecules sort of matter we know, or we think we know about.
And of course, human perception, which we rely on so much, is extremely crude in some senses. We can only perceive what? A tiny fragment, less than 1% of the electromagnetic spectrum, the visual bit of
Right.
it, and that's it. And
Yeah.
yet we still say, we still insist, don't we? Seeing is believing.
Yeah.
And yeah. So, in terms of your own work now on consciousness, your book has been extremely well received around the world, and you have appeared on quite a number of podcasts and broadcasts and everything. Where are you taking this now? Are you continuing to do your research into the latest adventures into consciousness by science and others?
One never stops, Tim. But the latest adventures, one has to be a little careful to ensure that they are really new adventures and not just rehashing what someone else has said. Because still there is this um, desire to find out what generates consciousness rather than really turning the whole problem back on, back to front.
And
So I am trying to filter out the latest and the best papers and books that point increasingly to the ancient wisdom. Federico Fagin, for example, invented the Intel processor. And the more these insights come from a hard scientist, atheist, who is now seen the light, so to speak, the more ice it'll cut, to mix metaphors a bit. So it's all one thing to say, oh, well, he was religious to start with. Of course, he would say that. But if he was an atheist to start with, and now he's saying this, that would really hit the mark.
yes, it does seem to me that there is this, although some scientists are religious people, there does seem to be a
Oh,
hard
mm,
separation between
mm,
um, science on the one hand and
mm,
religions and or
mm,
spirituality on the other. And there is no reason why these things have to be incompatible, because a lot of the early scientists, the people that you're interested in,
of
people like Sir
course,
Isaac Newton, were devoutly religious people,
devoutly
weren't they?
religious. Yes, most certainly. And their feeling for divinity drove their science because they saw themselves as a channel, an active channel of the divine wisdom. And the divine wisdom is all very well, but on earth, it needs to be earthed. And it is earthed through the mathematics and the experiments of these great scientists who have, extended their antenna, but also earthed what they saw so it was available to all humanity and not just themselves.
Are there scientists of that caliber around today, Eddie?
I don't think so, Tim. And who am I to say that? Not that I know of. There are some wonderful scientists, but if we're talking of the Newtons and Leibniz of this world, there cannot be many because they have set the scene for centuries. And there are many legendary scientists, but of that caliber, I don't know. Probably not.
One thing I also personally find rather difficult with science is its lack of ethics and morality in many
Yeah, yeah,
different areas. You know,
yeah,
it
yeah.
will come out with new inventions which get commercialized or maybe weaponized, but it never
Mm,
really considers the full implications of what these things are going to do to wider society. Who would have
yes.
thought, for example, who could have predicted that the mobile phone,
Mm,
starting out as a
yes,
means of communication, will become a weapon of alienation almost in many
yes,
different respects?
yeah.
And also the way that technology is used to control, carry out surveillance, and all the other unpleasant things. And I wish science did have a deeper and more abiding sense of morality. But am I being over cynical? Am I being over
Well,
critical?
you're being under cynical, Tim, because there is nothing, absolutely nothing in the laws of physics, mechanics, optics, acoustics, electricity, and magnetism. There's nothing that talks about morality. Science is not immoral, it's amoral.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, the morality, if it doesn't come from the individual, from many past incarnations of a very virtuous life, if it has to be inculcated in the individual, in the scientist, then whatever they may say about religion, it is religion that does it. Our ethical, as David Lorimer has put it so well, our ethical and moral understanding is the capital we get from religion. So religion provides more of the morality, and philosophy provides the ethics.
Yes, these of
So,
course
yeah.
have vanished largely. And when you talk about morality in the modern world, people
Oh,
kind
it's
of
a dirty word
snigger
almost.
about it almost as
Yeah,
if it's
that's right.
something from the past. Oh, we don't bother with that anymore. We don't bother about truth and beauty and nobility and all these things anymore.
We can take it back here. I was just thinking about this on my daily walk around the lake. That one can see this movement. Firstly, there was the age of science, wonderful. And then there was the worship of matter, physical matter. And then that morphed into materialism, the idea that whatever can't be explained by matter is either religious or superstition. But anyway, matter is the fundamental basis, physical matter. But then materialism has resulted, and this is the point, in our value system now based on matter. So the more matter you have, i.e., the more money you have, the greater you are. So hence, morality has been crowded out because our entire value system, as we see now, and I needn't tell you where, is based on the notion that the richer you are, the more important you are, the more you should be taken seriously. Well, as I've always said, and I will never stop saying it, the most powerful man is the man or woman, of course, who can control himself. These billionaires who worship money and curl up into a ball when the share price of their company falls down are weak individuals. The
And yet we
strong
regard
man.
them as gods, Eddie. We regard these people as gods,
Yeah.
don't we?
So our value system has come, it's a legacy of science. You don't blame science, of course, but you can see that movement from science to matter to materialism to our value system based on matter, such that ethics and morality, well, we talk about that over tea or in the pub, but we don't take it seriously.
Hmm. And this is one of the important things that Theosophy has brought, because it has brought
Yes.
a deep sense of morality and ethics, and it has had huge influence, an invisible behind the scenes influence, which has kind of infiltrated popular consciousness without ever being an evangelistic movement of any kind. Do you
Yes.
think Theosophy can again become this vitalizing movement, this movement that can synthesize disparate ideas and bring
Mm,
different groups of people together? Because I see the Theosophical Society now not so much as a membership organization,
mm,
but
mm.
as an enabling movement, bringing
Yes.
people together. And I think to do
Facilitating.
that,
Mm,
frankly, Theosophy has to lose some of its kind of exclusivity, which I know has existed
precisely.
in some
Mm.
parts of the world.
Yeah.
Oh, there's us, the Theosophists, and then there's all the rest of them,
Yeah.
and near the
Yeah.
twain shall meet.
Yes. And this is where the second object, of course, comes into play. But if one overdoes that, one dilutes the whole thing and everything becomes theosophy. But anything taken to extremes is never a good idea. Um, it's theosophy. If we can update it in modern terms, the connecting thread is always one. But if we can update it in terms that the modern scientists and people now can understand, like you honestly do in your books and your um, Substack articles, then of course it'll stand a chance, and it always will. Because theosophy, one of the best definitions is divine ethics. And one of the most wonderful things about the Theosophical Society I've seen, Tim, is despite all the squabbling and all the things that go on when human beings try to say something, it has never promulgated psychic experimentation. It has never taken people down the left-hand path. And that, for me, indicates what a high source Theosophy has come from. It's come from such a high source that it has not ruined individuals, other than through their own stupidity, of course, but it has not ruined individuals by teaching them something that would result in unholy occultism or dark psychism. It's always maintained the education and the light.
And because Theosophy, one of its core teachings is there's no such thing as dead matter or empty space, everything is conscious. That, I
Precisely.
think, has indirectly led to a wider consciousness
Mm.
of, how fragile this earth is that we live on.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's been one of the midwives of the ecological and environmental
Mm.
movement.
Mm.
The idea that all the kingdoms of nature are intimately interdependent and
Mm.
interconnected. So it's had an invisible influence there, as far as I'm concerned.
It most certainly has, Tim, and I think the influence goes very far and wide, and it's not always immediately obvious. The ecological movement that you mentioned, I do think is an offshoot of this central idea that you just stated.
So Theosophy, its ideas, it strikes me, are as important as ever. But these messages, these core ideas, are
Mm.
as needed in the world today as they were back in 1875, and possibly more
Never
so.
more so. Mm.
But I think the challenge is for us as an organization to find
Mm.
new ways to present these timeless truths in a language that
Mm.
people can understand today,
Mm.
and in a medium that can be understood today.
Mm.
Because, as you know, Marshall McLuhan wrote back in the 60s, the
Mm.
medium is the message.
To a great extent, and one of the core ideas is karma, really to show quite clearly how karma operates, or the little understanding we have of it, of course. Firstly, using scientific analogies, Newton's third law, Le Chatelier's principle in chemistry, entanglement. and then move from that scientific platform to a metaphysical platform and say, why stop at the physical level? Obviously, if you hurt someone physically, there's a consequence, but what happens if you hurt someone emotionally? And what happens if you hurt the earth physically? What's that going to do? So, an understanding of karma would, or however fragmented, would be a major step towards the ethical and moral uplift that we are all longing for. I just heard yesterday, today, a deal's been signed to get rare metals and energy from Ukraine. Well, yes, but what's the implications of that? Well, the implications of that is that piece that you put in Theosophy and Esoterica about that incredible passage from the Vishnu Purana, that in this time of the Kali Yuga, women will only be good enough indulging in their bodies, but the earth will only be good enough for its mineral resources and plundering it. So, yeah, get your minerals, but then what? What are the implications? Who are you hurting? Who are you benefiting? What are you doing with it? There's very little understanding of the consequences. It's short-term thinking for me now.
And that's why we need a transmutation of values, don't we? And karma can help us to
Values.
do this. Because if people realize that they're going to benefit or suffer, or there are going to be consequences for whatever they do or say or think or feel,
Mm.
then over time, it won't happen immediately, I'm sure, but over time it will modify the way people act towards each other.
Most
Um,
certainly. Mm.
but it's a long job, this. I mean, it's a very long job to convince people. Although, when you look at the changes that have taken place during our
Yes,
lifetimes, if you'd mentioned karma in back in
I have.
1950,
Mm.
people have said,
Mm.
"What? What's karma?
Or
Never heard of it."
consciousness. Or consciousness.
Or consciousness. So these things have crept into the popular imagination now, and
Mm.
a lot of people believe in reincarnation. I think when they do these
Yes,
surveys, it's
yes.
about a third of people in America and roughly the same in Britain and
Mm.
in Europe. So it is an idea whose time has come, I believe.
It certainly has. And you mentioned reincarnation, but let's not forget NDEs, where the last person you would expect to become ethical and moral and spiritual and start reading the Bible, such a person has had that as a result of an NDE, which completely cuts across the idea that only the brain generates consciousness, and when you're clinically dead, you're as good as dead. So NDEs are a huge um, illuminator of this enlightened approach that we're talking about. And it's really proliferating. The number of people who are now talking about NDEs, and when I say number of people, number of hardened one-time atheist scientists, that's, quite an eye-opener.
And of course, people like Dr. Aben Alexander, who was
Mm,
a hard-nosed
mm,
materialist without spiritual bone in his body, gets
mm,
meningitis, goes on this week-long
yeah,
journey. He
mm,
knows as a neuroscientist that his brain is not functioning, it's shut
mm,
down. So
mm,
where is all this stuff coming from that he
right.
describes in his book, Proof
Mm,
of Heaven?
proof
And
of
when you get
heaven. Mm,
high-profile people like that, some of his
mm,
ideas are bound to rub off on the scientific
yeah,
community, aren't they?
yeah.
Just let me get you to look at the blue skies ahead of us, Eddie.
Mhm.
What
Yeah.
do you think the most important priorities are for the Theosophical movement at the moment, and what direction do you think it should be taking? Because clearly, when we reach 150th anniversary, it's a
Mm,
key milestone, and I think a good opportunity to
mm.
ponder what the future might look like, where we want it to be.
The mission is always one. Where we want it to be, I think, would be more engaged with other like minded spiritual societies. I'd like to see the Theosophical Society, the Scientific Medical, IONS, the Anthroposophical coming together because strength lies in unity. And even though that obviously has its problems, terminology is different, and organizations are different. But if we can rise above those sort of petty differences, there is tremendous strength in the unity of the mission. I don't see much communication between anthroposophy and theosophy at the moment. You know, it's very much in its own conclave. So
And yet, many people have interest or belong to a number of these
they
organizations.
do, as individuals. But if they could come together as a group, see the materialistic scientists are very much together as a group, but spiritual societies are not. And almost by definition, it's difficult to have different societies coming together as a group. But in terms of blue skies, at one time it was right for theosophy to be exclusive because you have to be exclusive to put your stake in the ground and to be yourself. But then once you've been yourself, there's no point in shouting that all the time. You can be inclusive rather than exclusive. So inclusivity is, I think, the blue sky that you're talking about.
Yes, and that means breaking down a lot of the old
Yeah,
barriers, really, and the idea
yes.
of this us and them mentality, which I've certainly detected. But when I first joined the society about 20 years ago, and I was at some
Mm,
bookstall at a
mm,
TS event, and I picked up one of those thin books by Annie Bessant, you
mm,
know, those thin volumes which explain
mm.
theosophy in very plain and straightforward terms. And this person hissed in my ear, "You shouldn't
Yeah,
read that rubbish." And I said,
yeah,
"Why not?"
yeah,
"Oh, because it's rubbish and it's all wrong." And I said, "Why?" And the person just walked away. I won't
yeah,
say who it was.
exactly. To
Uh,
ask them why. Anyone can say rubbish, but explain what is rubbish about it. And my first book was The Ancient Wisdom by Annie Besant. And my gosh, I've, my gratitude for her knows no bounds. And she did exactly what we're talking about, trying to make these things simple, but also practical, to put it in practical terms during those days.
yes, and also to repeat the point, you know, I mean, she expressed things and in her time, and Annie Besant and Leadbeater came a few years later and re-expressed everything at a time when the mass media were just getting underway. So they
Yes,
knew
yes,
that the
yes.
language of the Victorian era had to
Mm, mm,
change in some
mm.
way. Of course, now of because of the pandemic a few years ago, people have started to link up on Zoom and other
Mm,
platforms and
mm.
so on. And I think this is a very, very welcome development. For
It
example,
is.
the lodge that I run in Leeds now
Mm.
has people coming in from Greece, Finland, Egypt,
Wonderful.
all over
Mm,
the place. And,
mm.
you know, just to say that this meeting is there for our lodge members is ludicrous because a local lodge meeting now is an international event.
Absolutely, yes. And breaking down this exclusivity, as you say, is very, very important.
Well, on that particular note, Eddie, thank you very much for a
Mm.
very interesting and enlightening conversation. I always learn
Thank you,
something every time I speak to you. So thank you very
oh,
much
thank you
for
very much, Tim.
taking the time. And we'd also like to thank the Theosophical
Yes,
Society
certainly.
in America for hosting us, because you can probably tell from the accents we are
Mm.
not from the United States. But anyway, thank you very much for
Thank you very
joining us
much,
this
Tim.
evening. And we hope to have some more of these interviews for you again in the future.
That's wonderful, Tim. And to invite other people of like mind onto our platform and share in that way. Thank you, Tim. And thank you, TSA.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.